evening maybe. And welcome to today's Fiber Network Council Asia Pacific flagship webinar inside APAC Hyperscale room. Our flagship data centers Panorama uh, report. And thank you for joining us. Today's session will explore the rapid evolution of the APAC region's data center landscape, including hyperscale growth trends, emerging investment footprint, or AI-driven infrastructure demand, and the critical role of fiber and the digital infrastructures enabling the region's next phase of transformation. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded via Microsoft Teams, and the recording will be shared later through FNCAP channels where applicable. Please feel free to submit your questions anytime through the Q&A section during the webinar. Now, feel free. We will try to address as many questions as possible during the discussion, time permitting. The presentation slide may be made available upon request after the webinar. And please, next slide, please. Now, this is a little bit about our organization. Basically, we established as a Fiber to the Home Council Asia Pacific on March 9th, 2005. More than 20 founding members, and promote the full fiber-based connectivity and the technologies and solutions and the business model across the Asia Pacific region. Because addressing the fiber optic technologies to drive economic growth, sustainability, and the quality of life. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is a summary of our council's activities. So participation and activities, and also the publication and resources. Now you can get some white papers and report through our website. And the member focused initiative, because now we think it's very important to have some memberships and networking between the industry that would accelerate our business model. And finally, we have the key event and the programs. Now, this webinar is one of the key programs. And next slide, please. And 7 board of directors taking an initiative over the council. The board of directors are very regional, diverse. Japan, China, Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, and Australia. And next slide, please. So now it is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Katrina Yap, APAC Managing Director of Infocom Advisory Group. Katrina brings more than 2 decades of experience across the fiber broadband, 5G, and digital infrastructure, research and advisory of the APAC region, and is widely recognized for her expertise in telecom and the data centers market intelligence. So, and during, next slide, please.
Sorry.
Sophie?
Yeah. Just give me a second. Yeah.
Yeah. Please do not forget, feel free to write your questions in the for the Q&A sessions during our webinar. So we try to cover as many as possible, the speakers and the time permitting. So this is some interactive discussions is more useful and more valuable to all of us. So now, Katerina, now it's your time, and thank you for joining us today. And the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Hanatani-san, for that introduction. Good afternoon to everyone. So let me share my screen. All right, so I hope my screen is visible to everyone and my audio is working well. But thank you so much to the Fiber Network Council APAC for organizing today's webinar and also for launching this initiative to have a flagship report that will represent an overview, a market view, and a very localized regional view of how the data center and hyperscalers market is evolving within our region. So what I'll be sharing today is, as I said, it's a regional view of how the Asia Pacific data center and hyperscaler landscape is evolving, particularly how AI, cloud expansion, fiber infrastructure, energy availability, and digital policy are beginning to reshape infrastructure priorities across the region. So this is especially important because the conversation around data centers is no longer just about co-location capacity. It's also increasingly becoming a broader discussion about national digital infrastructure readiness and initiatives. So for the members of the Fiber Network Council and to our attendees today, whether you are in the telecom space, fiber manufacturing, optical systems, construction, engineering, or regulation, or even in investments, these developments create both opportunities and strategic implications for you. So one of the clearest trends that we are seeing is that APAC's data center and hyperscaler market is accelerating faster than many originally expected or even anticipated. And there are several forces that are driving this simultaneously. So on one hand, you have increasing AI workloads as digital economies across the region continues to expand, even in emerging markets. There's also increasing enterprise cloud migration, not only among large enterprises, but also even among SMEs. And of course, this migration involves as well increasing digitalization efforts of governments for smart cities or smart governance. Digital sovereignty initiatives is also a driving force in the hyperscaler data center expansion in the region. And because of this increasing consumption of digital content, there's also a growing demand for low latency digital services everywhere else within the region. And what is interesting for us when we were doing this study is that it's no longer concentrated only in traditional hubs like Singapore, Tokyo, or Hong Kong. What you're going to see in the succeeding slides is that the expansion is also going into secondary and emerging markets. There's definitely a growing demand and even an investment appetite for it. And hyperscalers and operators are increasingly looking for additional power availability. So that's one of the drivers. Lower cost land for in terms of resources, geographic redundancies, and even new growth corridors in order to continue to expand their revenue streams. So this creates for us a much larger infrastructure opportunity across the broader APAC region. So to just ground everybody on, how we arrived at the data in the study and how we arrived at the insights we're going to be sharing with you this afternoon. One of the challenges that we encountered in APAC is that because the market is evolving very quickly, and in very siloed manner at the same time. So we've seen that the visibility across the entire region remains fragmented. There are different data that is available in the market, different information at different time points, but there is no single unified definition on how to quantify or even to size the market, the entire data center market within the APAC region. So different countries define what a data center is. There are different ways of classifying it, and information is very scattered across operator disclosures, investment announcements, and even government initiatives. So the goal of this work, and this is in 2025, is the first year that the council has launched this flagship report. And the idea is to be able to continue to develop this landscape or this panorama of the data center and hyperscalers market to create a more unified regional perspective for everyone. So for stakeholders like telco operators, fiber operators, infrastructure investors, and even regulators, providing you a clear regional view is important for your investment planning, ecosystem partnerships, policy development, and even infrastructure prioritization. So the analysis is a combination of analyzing, reviewing, and validating information that were captured from public company disclosures, from financial reports, investor materials, reputable news sources. And we also conducted expert discussions with infrastructure stakeholders across the region. And we will continue to do it in order to make sure that we gain a fresh perspective and a very local perspective of how the market is evolving. We also conducted cross-validation of information to make sure that we give a regional view or a unified view. But since this is still an evolving market and evolving landscape as well, rather than focusing on exact absolute numbers, the intent for us this afternoon is to provide you with directional patterns, strategic movements, and even a view or insights on how the ecosystem is shifting across the Asia Pacific region. Okay, so let's start with this. One of the biggest takeaways that we came up with when this study was commissioned and was executed is that the scale of expansion within the region is actually very significant. And it was estimated that by the end of 2025, the region was actually expected to exceed over 1,000 commercial data center or co-location hubs. This excludes like internal data center facilities of enterprises or data centers used by telco operators for their shared services, for instance. So this over 1,000 co-location hubs that we are talking about are all for the commercial market, and at least 34% of this. So this is still expected to grow by 34% in the next 5 years. As you can see here in the graph, China remains a very dominant market, especially in terms of scale. But even as in terms of its present scale, it's already very significant, very dominant. You can see from the orange bar that the planned build outs in the next 3 to 5 years will is also still very significant, and will continue to put it ahead of most of the markets in APAC region. I think this tells us of how critical the role of the Chinese market is to this growing demand for hyperscalers capability or capacity within the region. But at the same time, we're also seeing increasing momentum in other markets. For instance, Australia, even as a mature market, we continue to see build outs or planned build outs in Australia. The same thing also in Japan, and then increasingly also in India, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. So what is important here is that the market is becoming much more geographically distributed. And if historically hyperscaler activity was concentrated in a few mature hubs like Singapore, Australia, Japan, for instance, now we're seeing that operators or data center players are pursuing more multi-country deployment strategies, and hyperscalers also are pursuing multi-country deployment strategies. And later on, when we go through the different slides, you'll see as well the geographic presence that they already have or are planning to have across the region. For the fiber ecosystem, on the other hand, this means for you that the demand growth will not only come from the metro areas, but it will also come from regional transport networks, interconnection infrastructure, subsea systems, and even edge connectivity. Now, If we will group the different countries within APAC, and for this study, we covered 22 countries within the Asia Pacific region, we can more or less divide them or classify them into three categories. You have your mature markets, which I mentioned earlier. You have your high growth or emerging markets, and then you have your early stage markets. So for the mature markets, what is very characteristic of them, of course, is that they dominate the market because they have been in the industry longer, they have stronger fiber infrastructure, they have more stable regulatory environments, especially around data protection and data sovereignty. They also have advanced interconnection systems, and they already have, as I said earlier, existing hyperscaler presence. But even if that is the case, as you would see in here, based on planned build outs and investments in the next 3 to 5 years, we are anticipating that the data center and co-location hubs in the mature markets is still expected to grow by around 30% in the next 3 to 5 years. And this is driven by also the changing nature of the demand for their facilities and their services. So the next wave that we are seeing for these mature markets is that it's going to be increasingly AI driven. So this includes autonomous systems, robotics, Industry 4.0, immersive applications, and even large-scale AI inferencing and training workloads that is going to be located in these particular markets. So these applications require extremely high performance infrastructure environments. And so in order to be able to accommodate all of this, then the successive build outs in these mature markets are geared towards more hyperscaler ready or AI ready facilities in these markets. But these mature markets, you will see later on, are also facing their own constraints, and so now they also have to compete not only on availability but also on sustainability, power resilience, and even advanced optical networking capabilities. If we move on to the high growth markets, so you see in here countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, and even New Zealand. What we are seeing in these high growth markets is that they're becoming increasingly interesting and significant for hyperscalers because they are seen as alternative regional hubs. They are also overflow capacity markets from the mature hubs in Singapore, Australia, Japan, South Korea, for instance. And they're also being viewed as redundancy locations to increase resiliency of the data center network and resiliency as well of the applications that are running in these facilities. So what these high growth markets have in common is that unlike the mature markets, they have lower build out costs. They also have more land availability, and they're more open, or they're increasingly more open through to new investors or even foreign investors. And there's also an improving infrastructure ecosystems in these markets. So this is especially relevant because, as I mentioned earlier, for the mature markets, they're increasingly facing power constraints, land limitations, and because of that as well, stricter environmental regulations, which is becoming stricter and stricter, especially with the current energy crisis that we are experiencing globally. The third group would be your early stage markets. This would be the long-term opportunity markets for the data center and hyperscalers market within the region. What we are observing from these markets is that they have growing digital populations. They also have growing startup ecosystems and increasing cloud demand. However, the challenge for these early stage markets is that their fiber backbone is still growing in terms of maturity. There's still a lot of infrastructure gaps. There are also some challenges around reliability of power supply. And for some of these markets also, their connectivity or their connection to the international cable systems is still limited. So because of that, there is still some ways to go. But in the long term, this is where the growth is expected to come because of the opportunities in these markets. So for the members of this council and the audience for today, this could represent for you long-term growth opportunities across fiber rollouts, optical transport, stable connectivity or subsea connectivity rather, and ecosystem partnerships, which are what we're seeing now is increasingly critical for the growth of the data center and the hyperscalers market in these particular countries. So who are the players within this ecosystem? Let's start with the telcos. And what we're seeing in here in the past couple of years is that the telcos are increasingly evolving in terms of their role within the data center evolution of the region. Historically, telco providers are considered as connectivity providers into data centers. But now, many of them are becoming data center operators, infrastructure investors, renewable energy partners, and even AI infrastructure collaborators. We see this in particular in emerging APAC markets where telcos are really driving the next wave of data center growth and data center build out in these countries. On the other hand, in the more mature markets, the ones that are driving growth are other players like co-location providers that have a very expansive presence already in those countries. So why is this happening? Because hyperscalers increasingly require integrated ecosystems, combining connectivity, power, interconnection, cloud access, and even regional transport capabilities. This puts telcos at an increasingly significant and relevant positioning in the market. So that's why, especially in the emerging markets, the telcos are really expected to be the main driving force here in terms of expansion of the data center landscape in their particular areas. On the other hand, the other major player in the ecosystem would be what we would call global carrier neutral co-location providers. So these companies are not necessarily telco originated. Only a few of them, like for instance, NTT, but the rest, for instance, either they're coming more or they evolve more from investment companies, from joint ventures like STT GDC, or they are data center co-location experts or specialists for many years now, like Equinix, for instance. So what this slide is showing us is how aggressively actually these global carrier neutral co-location providers are expanding across APAC. So if we are talking about footprint, if we're talking about co-location spaces, these companies are in somewhat of a competition at the same time, cooperation with the telco players that are also expanding in their respective markets. And if you would take a look at this heat map, for instance, you would see in here that these companies, they're global, or we call them global co-location leaders, because they are not just operating or building out in select markets, but they are increasingly dispersed across the region. The darker shade in here tells you that they're not only operating in those markets, but they're even planning successive build out. So meaning they're building more facilities. And then there are also those in the lighter green color there where there are specific announcements specifically in terms of commitments for new build outs or new investments. And those that are in a lighter shade, it means that in the recent news, they have identified these markets as potential markets of interest for them for future build outs, even if they don't have any specific investment commitments yet. So they're really moving across the region in here, and they are pursuing aggressive footprints around Southeast Asia, East Asia, even South Asia also. And they're definitely going more into the secondary markets, not just in the mature markets, as we said earlier. So what this tells us is that there's a growing need for regional redundancy. That's why these players are increasingly expanding in these markets. There's also the demand that is created because of the need to have more sovereign infrastructure So as more markets or as more countries, for instance, develop their data sovereignty laws, then it creates an increasing need to co-locate servers and edge networks in those markets. And that's why they need to be present in those in order to capture the potential market in those areas. And in relation to that, also increasing digital consumption is the need to have more distributed cloud architecture. So another important implication of the presence of these players is that interconnection density is becoming increasingly valuable. As you see in how we call them, they are global carrier neutral co-location leaders. Their expertise is more in terms of building out the facilities, but the interconnection capabilities are still going to be provided by largely the telco players there or the fiber infrastructure providers. So there's an increasing need there to have the stronger collaboration as they continue to expand also in these markets. And then, of course, we have our hyperscalers, the likes of Alibaba, AWS, Google Cloud, Huawei Cloud, Microsoft Azure, and the likes. And this slide, what this highlights us. So this is, by the way, based on what we captured from the research as of October 2025. And there have been some new pronouncements since then, which we will also share towards the end of this presentation. So we're seeing in here that they are definitely scaling their cloud regions and availability zones across APAC. And what is driving this growth for them? Number one is, of course, latency requirements as consumers and businesses from micro to large enterprises increasingly make use of digital applications and consume digital content. There's a very heavy requirement to reduce latency for these applications in order to improve or protect customer experience. There's also an increasing need for redundancy and resiliency of access to infrastructure to maintain continuous availability of these services. There are also the data sovereignty requirements, which I mentioned earlier, which is a driving force for why hyperscalers would move into or co-locate into specific markets. And there's the growing demand from AI workloads because of increasing use of these AI applications and platforms also in these countries. So these countries as well, what we're seeing is that they increasingly want local cloud infrastructure to also support government digitalization efforts. So in our research, for instance, we saw how some countries, the governments in different countries are really highlighting their own smart governance, smart city initiatives because it presents as a very significant market, of course, for data center providers and, of course, for the hyperscalers because this could present a significant volume for them. Growing AI ecosystems, and also increasing need to strengthen cybersecurity posturing or cybersecurity practices to protect data within their countries, and most especially to protect personal data as well. And another driving force in here would be, of course, the enterprise transformation, especially in most markets in Asia Pacific. You have many markets there with a significant SME base where there is ongoing digital transformation, companies migrating their workloads to the cloud, companies shifting to SaaS applications for their business process systems. So all of these transformation that is happening in the business sector across many markets in Asia Pacific is a driving force for these hyperscalers to look into situating themselves or co-locating themselves in different countries within the APAC region. So for some examples, for instance, so the pictures we're gonna show you is, of course, not comprehensive. We're just featuring a couple of data center facilities that has been in the news recently to kind of give everybody an idea of the evolution in the market. For instance, we're seeing how APAC data center landscape, or rather, we're seeing the construction of hyperscale AI-ready campuses, telecom-led expansion, like the example that you see here, Vitro, which is a brand under PLDT, cross-border capital flows, and also large-scale investment activities. In the Philippines as well, aside from Vitro, you also have STPGDC, which is another major player in the market. And this particular facility, for instance, is one of their hyperscale ready infrastructure that they have built and are opening in Quezon City, which is at the heart of Metro Manila. We're also seeing the same example in other markets in Southeast Asia. Indonesia, for instance, is there's very high momentum in Indonesia, if you can recall in the previous chart that I showed, in terms of the build out of data center facilities, including AI-ready infrastructure. And this recent news, for instance, highlights a growing investor appetite for data center assets in the Indonesian markets. That's the same thing also we're observing even in Malaysia. Malaysia continues to attract large-scale regional investments because of its proximity to Singapore. So they're an overflow capacity market definitely for Singapore. There's of course more land availability, and there's more power access in Malaysia, which is attractive for some customers of data center facilities in Singapore that are increasingly running out of capacity. We also intentionally added examples of some data center facilities outside of APAC, such as the one that you're seeing in Canada, for instance. This one is another facility that was built in Europe. And what this basically just demonstrates to us is that what is happening in markets outside of APAC will eventually also be happening, if not already happening, within the Asia Pacific market. And what we will continue to see in there, especially in terms of the successive build outs from here onwards, would be data center facilities that are increasingly more energy efficient, companies that are employing as well sustainability practices in the way that they are running and operating their data center facilities, more liquid cooling technology, especially to address energy constraints, and also more net zero infrastructure design that we are anticipating to see in the market, in the APAC market in the coming years. So to kind of summarize, what were the main investment themes that is shaping the growth of the region, or that will continue to shape the growth of the region in the next 3 to 5 years? Some of the important trends that are coming out that we're seeing is that there's definitely more investment in AI-ready infrastructure. We are also seeing more geographic diversification, and even also more regional substitution. So some markets that would know, or some customers or hyperscalers as well that would normally go to mature markets will also look into secondary or emerging markets. But more than that, the geographic diversification also exists by them not just going into the usual metro areas, but even looking at locations adjacent to these metro areas where there is more access to more affordable land, for instance, or more access to renewable energy or to different power supply sources. We're also seeing more edge expansion and definitely more implementation of green infrastructure, especially to not just for ESG compliance, but this is also to kind of pacify potential fears or apprehensions from local communities who are worried about the potential environmental impact of these data center build outs in their communities. We're also seeing how governments are actively branding themselves as future hyperscaler destinations. And then another major shift also that we're seeing, as mentioned earlier, is really the movement towards secondary cities within these markets. So it's not just really the metro cities that will be a target there, but even the markets outside of it. in terms of how hyperscalers decide on which markets they will enter or co-locate in. What we are seeing also from the discussions that we have had and from the research that we have conducted is that the decision making is multidimensional for them. So it's not just about looking at who has more land or who can provide them with more incentives, but their evaluation is now really more multidimensional. They're looking at the fiber ecosystems in those markets. They're looking at a market's international connectivity. They're also looking into renewable energy availability. They're also considering as well, actually, like the availability of engineers or skilled talent, in especially in AI and machine learning. They're also looking at regulatory stability. So it's not just the attractiveness for business or for investors, but really the stability of regulation. So the availability and stability of regulations for that matter, and interconnection density. So this would involve, the number of players available, the capacity that is present in those markets and in those facilities, and also their interconnection with the regional or global or cross-border subsea cable systems. So this means that infrastructure competitiveness is becoming more ecosystem-based rather than asset-based when hyperscalers are looking into expansion in new markets. And for the members of the council and also for our audience today, this reinforces why fiber infrastructure still really foundational in order to make the region more competitive, especially in the data center and hyperscalers landscape. Governments across the APAC region is also becoming more active. As I mentioned earlier, many governments are branding their countries as attractive destinations for AI and hyperscaler ecosystems. And so they are definitely playing an important role in shaping digital infrastructure development. So across markets where there is a growing and thriving data center landscape, we are seeing, for instance, the following policies or frameworks present, which makes them attractive to these hyperscalers and even to like these multinational enterprises that want to co-locate their servers in different countries. So number one, for instance, cloud first policies. Those markets where there is growing demand and growing facility for the data center market usually have cloud first policies. The governments also usually have AI strategies. So you would see that the AI strategy is not just particular to the private sector or the enterprise sector, but AI strategies that are led by the government is signaling to investors that there's a significant potential in these markets. ESG-linked regulations, which is very important, especially for some hyperscalers that are increasingly facing pressure from their stakeholders and shareholders on their ESG compliance. Renewable energy initiatives, which is also becoming increasingly critical, and also stricter approval processes to make sure that their markets are robust enough in terms of accommodating these new businesses or these new players that are entering in the market. So all in all, what we're seeing in there is that governments in these countries are trying to balance attracting investments into their countries, but also at the same time with regulations around renewable energy, power supply, and ESG. They're also trying to manage potential energy and energy concerns or energy limitations. Sustainability as well in order to pacify local communities, and also it's to ensure that digital sovereignty is still maintained across their markets. So in summary, the strategic implications for our audience today is that number one, infrastructure investment will definitely determine a country's market positioning in the data center and hyperscaler landscape within the region. The second thing also, power stability and renewable access energy will become core competitive differentiators across markets and also a differentiator for the region itself. Third, as well, is that resiliency and diversification strategies will become increasingly important because of geopolitical risks, cybersecurity threats, and even infrastructure concentration concerns. Regulatory transparency is also very key in order to promote long term investor confidence. And finally, the digital adoption themselves within these markets, especially for these next wave technologies, will further drive edge expansion and infrastructure density into the region. So, an important point that we really want to emphasize from this presentation is that APAC remains highly diverse. This reporting that we're doing, for instance, is going to continue to evolve in the coming years, especially as we try to define and quantify and size the market more and more. But even as these differences and lack of a unified view is still happening, one thing is really very clear to everyone that APAC is becoming one of the most important long-term digital infrastructure growth region globally in the market. So not sure if I have time, but just very quickly in here, if you will gain access to this report, then we also updated in here some of the recent events. Ever since this report was published, we also incorporated in here what has been happening in these markets in the past couple of months. So from November up to present, for instance. So we're seeing more announcements around massive hyperscaler investments, stricter energy regulations, especially because of the ongoing energy crisis, growing sovereign AI initiatives, and increasing really focus on AI-ready infrastructure systems. So what we showed you earlier as planned build-outs, most of those planned build-outs are really for AI-ready infrastructure, while the older facilities continue to be maintained and upgraded for local enterprise customers. We're also seeing developments in terms of cooperation and coordination within the industry. For instance, in some markets, we're seeing alliances across or among data center providers happening. For instance, last year or early this year in the Philippines, there was the data center initiative among players within the industry. So alliances like this, like the one in the Philippines, and which is also already present in other markets, the goal really there is to have like a unified voice to promote the data center market for their country. But at the same time, it's also to facilitate energy coordination, policy engagement, localization initiatives, and for some markets, even infrastructure collaboration. Another thing also that we're seeing in here is really AI, without a doubt, is dramatically increasing the strategic importance of fiber. The future deployments we are seeing in here, especially as it is relevant for the data center providers, will be ultra high capacity backbone infrastructure, dense interconnection, low latency regional routing, and even more resilient transport architectures to support all of these data center deployments. And by the way, these deployments are not just within the metro cities. As mentioned earlier, there's increasing diversification even into secondary cities in these markets, both in the mature and even in the emerging ones. So there's definitely a need to also pay attention to the robustness of the fiber architecture in adjacent cities to the metro areas. Lastly, looking ahead, we're seeing that there will continue to be a stronger acceleration towards AI-ready data centers within the region, what we expect for the rest of 2026. We also anticipate that there would be more government interventions around energy policies, ESG, sovereignty laws, and even digital infrastructure planning. We also expect that there will continue to be expansion into emerging and secondary markets like in Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, and Pakistan. so including Pakistan there. And then fourth as well, and perhaps very important for this audience, is that fiber networks will increasingly become a core competitive differentiator for countries seeking hyperscaler and AI investments. So countries with strong backbone, infrastructure, resilient transport networks, international connectivity, and scalable interconnection systems, they will likely emerge as the strongest there in terms of long-term positioning within the APAC data center and hyperscale market. So with that, I conclude with this. APAC is emerging as a high-growth hyperscale opportunity zone. It's definitely no longer just a data center story, but it is already a broader digital infrastructure story where fiber, energy, AI readiness, regulation, sustainability, and ecosystem coordination across the multiple players in the market, how all of these factors need to evolve in order to continue to put the APAC region into a growth path or into a high growth path in the coming years. So with that, thank you for listening. I think I exceeded my time a little bit.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Very excellent presentation and very useful and informative and comprehensive. And so it is good to know that our market is not only today and tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Please, now you showed us some three market segmentation: matured, high growth, and early stage. That is a wonderful business opportunities that we are having. And now it's in the Q&A times. And Rusafi, did you get any Q&A from the audience?
Yes, I think some questions are coming up, but yeah, so to the audience again, if you have any queries or questions, just please feel free to drop the questions. So we will definitely discuss with the speaker for today, Katrina. So I think, yeah, just, yeah,
Katrina, I have one question because you should mention that some uniqueness of Asia Pacific market is some influence of interaction of a telecom operator or something like that. So what role do telecom and fiber infrastructure providers play in the AI-driven data center expansion happening across the APAC?
Okay. Telcos and fiber infrastructure providers,
Sure.
what role do they play? Okay. Well, I think there's a shift in terms of their role. Not just they're no longer just connectivity providers, but they are very critical infrastructure partners for the data center players and the data center operators in these markets. Because I think what we've learned so far, especially in what we highlighted in the different slides that we showed this afternoon, is how critical a very robust fiber infrastructure market is, how critical and necessary that is in order to attract more of these hyperscale investments into the region. So we're talking here about ultra high capacity fiber backbones, more low latency interconnection, more resilient domestic transport networks. And the thing there, Hanatani-san, is that hyperscalers are not just looking that these are present within metro cities, but even in secondary cities. So there's definitely a need to prioritize expansion also into those secondary cities market because they are seen as critical in terms of achieving redundancy and resiliency, especially for these investors in the hyperscaler landscape or hyperscaler market.
Thank you very much. The next questions now, what do you think will be the biggest challenge for APAC and data center sector over the next few years or several years?
I think a biggest challenge there, which I
Yeah.
think is not unique only to the APAC market, would really be the access uh, to power, because power is,
Mm,
of course, it's a finite
power.
resource,
Mm,
and mature markets are already facing that. They are in a way constrained in their deployments and build outs, simply because of limitations in power supply. That's why these hyperscalers are also going into other markets where there is more availability of power in those areas. The thing though is that, and this occurs, and again, this is not just unique to the APAC region, but as they go into those markets and expand into those markets, then eventually they could create as well um, some challenges there in terms of power availability. That's why access to renewable energy is very important. Discussions around power and energy consumption matters. So in some markets, for instance, we've seen how they're really committing to efficient use of power and even water resources, to not just ensure long-term sustainability of their markets, but also to pacify local communities who are open to the idea of these players expanding into their areas, but are wary of the environmental impact. So I think that's the number one thing. And then the second important thing I think would be regulatory. The mature markets benefit because of very stable regulatory frameworks and infrastructure. But even in emerging and high growth markets, the regulation is still evolving. Some laws are already present, but the execution and even the monitoring of how those laws are being implemented is still a work in progress, if I may put it that way. And some markets do not yet have those sovereignty laws, or they may have data protection laws, but it's not yet fully implemented. So those challenges, I think, will play a role for some markets. That's why the role of the government here is really very crucial in addressing that, and also in terms of building that long-term investor confidence, because that was one of the primary reasons why the mature markets evolved early, because they developed those regulatory frameworks first, and they strengthened their ability to implement and monitor the enforcement of those regulations.
thank you. So the stable power availability and regulatory friendly regulation is a key, isn't it?
Yes.
And so, do you have any example of a successful regions which investor-friendly policy and the regulations are set up?
The emerging markets, actually, the markets in the emerging countries are good examples. Of course, the mature markets, that goes without saying, but in these emerging markets that I mentioned earlier, some of them have eased up on the ownership structure that is available to foreign investors. They've also created more attractive policies around land ownership or around land tenancy, which of course for those new investors looking to deploy or build out in these new markets is of course a very important consideration there, whether they can own the land or for how long they can lease a land, for instance. And then in these emerging markets also, we've seen how they try to improve on the ease of doing business, like putting up new companies or participating in joint ventures, or having fast lanes in terms of processing documents, permits, and the like, so that they can fast track the rollout of these facilities. So those are actually more than the regulation. Those developments in ease of doing business is what we're seeing to be increasingly dynamic in those emerging markets. And that's why they're emerging in that sense. They're high growth in that sense, because they're really opening up their markets to more of these investors, because they're seeing that there's limitation in the mature markets, and they are in a good position to capture that overflow, and the new demand that is being created by the consumption of AI applications and more digital content.
Thank you very much. Lusafi, do you receive any question from the audience?
So far, I didn't have any questions. I think the audience are a bit shy to ask the questions.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, Katrina, thank you for joining us today, and thank you again.
My pleasure.
Yeah. And before we close the session, on behalf of the Fiber Network Council, would Sophie, one slide back, please. One more. Yeah, please feel like to us to have any questions and comment and the feedback to us that be useful, and we are very happy to have a more interactive of the members and the even the non-members. And we have next webinars like this. The title is the state of 5G in APAC. Insight from the APAC 5G and the mini panorama and the Philippine market. And the date is the 9th of June, 4 p.m. Singapore time. Now, please feel free to make a registration to the webinar. Thank you again. And now, before we conclude on behalf of Fiber Network Council APAC, I'd like to sincerely thank you, Katrina Yap, again, and the Infocom Advisory Group for sharing the valuable insights with us today. And thank you to all the participants for joining this session. And we'd like to invite you to join our upcoming conference this year. The first one is Pacific Fiber Conference 2026, and 30th, 31st of July in Fiji, focused on Pacific Connected from the foundation of the AI era. And the next one, second one is our annual conference, Fiber Connect APAC Conference 2026. Now, 14th and 15th October in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, bringing together leaders across the fiber, AI data centers, and the digital infrastructures and ecosystems. Please don't miss this event. That is a very, very exciting one and very useful to all of you who are involved in the fiber network and the fiber connectivity industry. Thank you again, and see you next time.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.